If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, it would be greatly appreciated if you could give the podcast a 5-star rating. This helps other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. I'm your host, Andrew Pludger, and I'm a survivor of Bob Jones University. BJU is a fundamentalist college with its roots in white supremacy and is known for its culture of indoctrination, conformity, and control. Its influence extends beyond its campus, impacting Christian schooling, politics, biblical counseling, and evangelical Christianity. The school serves as a hub for churches, schools, and camps, and these institutions perpetrate its abusive teachings and practices. This show explores these areas of influence and amplifies the stories of those who have been impacted by Bob Jones University. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. Hello, everyone. I am really excited for you to hear today's episode. And I just want to say that this is the interview from the podcast Surviving BJU with Erin Burchwell. Her full interview was never released on that podcast, so I asked her if it was okay if I released the full interview on Beyond BJU. And she was okay with that. So if you listen to Surviving BJU, you might recognize bits and pieces of this episode. Erin Burchwell, she grew up at Bob Jones University, and she ended up being interviewed for the Grace Report, which is a report that was conducted at Bob Jones University regarding sexual abuse claims. And her story ended up being featured in the New York Times. Enjoy this interview with Erin Burchwell. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to have Erin Burchwell on the podcast today. Thank you so much, Erin, for coming on and being willing to share your story. But how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this podcast. I think it's very important.
Of course. Yeah, I'm so excited to do it. And I'm so excited to dig into your story. And a big part of your story is being interviewed for the Grace Report. And could you explain to people what the Grace Report is and the organization?
Yes. So the Grace Report, Grace is an acronym for an organization, Godly Response to Abuse in Christian Environments. It's an organization that is made up of some pastors, church lay people, lawyers, even some counselors, I believe, that is hired by Christian organizations, whether it be a mission board, possibly a church, a school, to come in and investigate any and all concerns related to sexual allegations or sexual assault allegations. And they go in, they interview the people who come forward and fill out the online questionnaire, ask them what happened, and more specifically, what the organization did after they reported the incidents. And they write a report that includes what happened and the organization's response, and then they give recommendations at the end as to what they should do moving forward, restitution and policy changes, other things like even memorials or apologies that needed to be issued, staff changes, etc. And it's a report that comes out with the permission of the organization. It's really interesting in Bob Jones's report. We know what grace is, but we still don't know why Bob Jones let them come in. It's a big mystery. I think that's the $1 million question that everyone would love to know. Why on earth Stephen Jones hired Grace? There's some theories, but was he trying to do the right thing? Did he know of some incidents and he was trying to do the right thing? Was he trying to stick it to his dad, Dr. Bob III? Or was he trying to quiet online chatter? Nobody knows why the university would have opened themselves up to this kind of a report, especially with how many people that came forward and all the stories. But for whatever reason, they did. And they put out a ploy somewhere in early 2013 and a questionnaire for people to fill out online. And that's where it started.
And so what was BJU's response when the report was released? Did they follow any recommendations? And what did they do with the organization Grace going forward?
When people started coming forward, by that March, the survey had been accessed over 538 times, and they had received more than 125 full reports. So they got a really big response. And so the investigation went a little bit longer than everybody thought it would go. But by January of the next year, so 1 full year later, Bob Jones terminated the report right before it came out. Grace says on their website that they don't know why it was terminated, but it was terminated. And so that's when a lot of us cried foul. It was supposed to be an anonymous report, but we felt that it was important to, after going through all this work of dredging up all these horrible memories for a lot of us, we thought we're not going to go out without saying what happened. And a bunch of people came forward. So they rehired them, or they reinstated Grace in February. And then it was a whole nother.
And sorry, what years? Can you say what years all this happened?
Yes, they were hired in January of 2013. They were terminated in January of 2014. Then the final report didn't come out until December of 2014. So it was almost a 2-year process. And I believe in the beginning, we were told it would be about 6 months. So it was difficult to wait that long for the report to come out. But in the end, they did let the report come out. And it was pretty damning in what happened to different people, how many people, and then what the university did. So the Grace made some recommendations, and honestly, Bob Jones, true to form, didn't really follow very many of them at all. In fact, Steve Pettit had given an apology somewhere in the middle of those 2 years. It was just a blanket apology. It took a lot of us off guard, like, oh, wow, I don't know that the school has ever apologized for anything before. But then by the time the report came out, he gave another apology, which was a non-apology, saying, if we hurt anyone or if we didn't do enough for you, then we're sorry. So that was one of the if-thens, which is a non-apology. Grace had several recommendations. They didn't really do anything. There was supposed to be a public apology. That was the apology. They were supposed to have something called recovery assistance, which means a third party was supposed to come in for the future and handle these things. To my knowledge, there's no third party. Everybody in Greenville is connected with Bob Jones in some way. Anyhow, there was supposed to be something called a degree completion assistance. That is, if you were kicked out or shipped in the middle of your degree because of assault, that they were supposed to help you come back and complete your degree. I don't know of anyone personally that happened with. They were supposed to do something called a time to listen, and that's where they were supposed to make contact with everyone that wanted to have contact. It was an anonymous report, but they were supposed to give out a blanket, like, please come forward and we will listen to you. I do know that Pettit did listen to some victims. I know 2 of them personally. I don't really think anything came out of it. I guess they did do that portion. There was supposed to be a file review with the police. I did get a call personally from the police. It wasn't a great, warm and fuzzy call. They were checking off a box, but I guess that did happen. They were supposed to do a memorial on campus. That didn't happen. And they were supposed to give an update on the changes 5 years from that. In fact, instead of giving an update, I believe I have this timeline correct. On the 5-year anniversary, instead of an update, they had Jim Berg speak in chapel that day on something related to either counseling or mental health or something along those lines. Those were the recommendations, those 7 things, and that's what's on their webpage. And the university really didn't do much of any of them.
I see. And really, for you, you grew up in this environment your whole life, right? At Bob Jones University.
Yes, my parents taught there. I was born there. I wasn't born on campus like most of my friends had to be born on campus in Barge, the hospital on campus. That's a whole nother podcast. My mom had a heart condition, so I was born off campus. But yes, I was theoretically born on campus and lived up until I graduated from college.
Yeah, so you were immersed in this world your entire life. Just the courage that it took for you to come forward about this environment and the abuse that happened. And really, why did you come forward when there was so much at stake for you, this being literally your entire world?
Yeah, I should add that the same year, beginning of 2014, when the Grace Report was terminated, Bob Jones fired my dad, who had been there 42 or 43 years. They didn't give a reason. Of course, I speculated that it could have had something to do with me speaking out. I did choose to speak out to the news, but when they fired Grace, so many of us had put so much effort into it and heartache, and our families had the same heartache seeing us hurt, that while it was healing, it was like, really, you're going to say, don't talk about this forever. 15 years in my case, I was told not to talk about what happened to me. Then all of a sudden it was, please come talk to us. And then it was, oh, never mind, shove it back. And so when they fired Grace, some of us decided that we needed to go forward. And the news contacted me. I don't know how it got started in the very beginning, but it snowballed. And the news asked me if I would interview in the morning on the local news. And I decided to, even though my parents didn't want me to. They still taught there. My dad got fired right after that. But I thought it was really important that some of the narrative gets squashed about the Grace Report. At the time, people were saying, well, it's just some disgruntled former grads or dropouts who hate the school. It's a very small number and the stories aren't true. And I thought by going on the news as a faculty kid, where, most of the faculty staff still knew me, my parents were still there, they might see that I really had nothing to gain by coming forward. I have a good job. I have a good life, 500 miles away. I have no reason to bring these things up again. It doesn't benefit me in any way. And that I'm not some stranger on the internet. I'm someone that grew up there. So I thought it was important to let people see that there's a problem. And then, of course, for the students who remain there, like so many of the faculty kids I grew up with, we didn't have a choice where we went to school. And I know that there are kids still who they feel as though they don't have a choice. And I know that's a difficult thing to explain because most people think you have a choice where you go to college, but a lot of us did not have a choice. And so for those remaining kids, I wanted it changed because the culture there and the views on women and assault needed to change so that it would stop happening.
And could you dig into their views on women and their views on women who are assaulted and how they're treated, and really when people came forward, what was said to them?
So having grown up as a faculty kid and a female, and just personally, I've experienced how women are treated differently. And I watched my mom as a faculty member have different treatment than my dad as a male faculty member. There's a lot of outward appearance for women. For instance, everything they wear is dictated, and it's an interesting balance because you're supposed to dress attractively so that you can find a mate, but at the same time, you're not supposed to dress immodestly or too flashy, but yet if you're too dowdy, then you're not. So there's this weird cultural balance, and it's shifted since I was there in the 90s, obviously, but it's still there. I had friends who were called in for wearing things that were too flashy. And then I know a girl who was in the same major as me in a lot of my classes, and she was called in because she didn't wear makeup. And she wasn't going to attract a guy and a life mate if she didn't wear makeup. So there was this weird, this is what you can wear and this is what you can't, but find this weird balance. The church that I went to, which was heavily affiliated with Bob Jones. The pastor was on the Bible faculty, still is. That church was stricter in a lot of ways than Bob Jones, which sounds so odd, but it was. The church I grew up at, they're very close to the Duggar Church, and I know that's being talked about a lot, but the women wore long skirts, had long hair. They were in the quiverful movement, although that they wouldn't say quiverful, like there weren't terms, but it's all the same. It's one, I really think that Bob Jones is sneakier than even the Bill Gothard movement, because the Gothard movement, as I've watched that documentary now, there are terms for things. And for instance, the term "I trap," you don't want to be a temptation to a man. We didn't have that term. Bob Jones has all those things, but they are smart enough to not put it in writing or not say it out loud. So they seem as though they're innocuous, and yet it's the same stuff. It's just really sneaky. So I also had the balance of this church. And so it's just, you couldn't win. If I was winning at Bob Jones, then I was losing at church. If I was winning at church, I was losing at Bob Jones. So I had other weird kind of cultural thing going on as a woman. Your body language was also something that was drilled into you as a woman, which I don't know that it was with men. How much you weighed was a spiritual matter, whereas I knew some overweight preacher boys. I don't ever remember them being pulled aside about their weight, but girls could definitely be pulled aside for being too thin or too heavy. I had friends in both those categories. Even something I didn't know until my adult life was, looking back, I struggle with my posture because I was told in not so many words that I shouldn't stick my chest out when I walked. So I had, even as a speech major, I had a problem with hunching. And when I look back, most of the women at the church I grew up have that hunch look where their shoulders are curled forward because you don't want to appear like you're sticking your chest out. And that's just one little tiny example of the kind of pressure that is placed on women. So yeah, your appearance was different. Even how you spoke. This was also addressed in the Happy Shiny People documentary. Women sometimes talked in a quieter voice like this because that was submissive, and you didn't want to sound too abrasive or intelligent or pushy or bossy, because that was not spiritual.
Or just dominant in general.
That's right. That's right. Because you were supposed to take the submissive route. And again, people will say that didn't happen because there's no recording of it, but culturally that was very much a thing. Even with women, there was a lot of pressure on reproduction, and it was both ways. It was, if you couldn't have a child, you were barren. And was there something wrong with you that God wasn't allowing your womb to be opened up? It's so gross saying that out loud now, but these were things that were said to people. When my mom had cancer the second time, the deacons of our church, all being also faculty at Bob Jones members, they asked her in our living room if she had any unconfessed sin that she needed to confess because she had cancer for a second time. I don't ever remember a man being asked if he had cancer because he had sin. But back to reproductions, there was a 3-child rule at Bob Jones. You were supposed to have kids, but faculty could only have 3 because that's all the school would pay for with education, meals, etc. You had to have kids, but not too many. When you were a GA, you weren't supposed to get pregnant. I have a friend that accidentally got pregnant and got reamed out by Phil Smith, reamed out. So yeah, those are just a couple things with women, but specifically with women who've been assaulted. When the story of what happened to me came out to the dean of students, Jim Berg, and Dean of Men, Tony Miller at the time, I got called in to tell them about it. The very first thing they asked me after I read my written several-page statement, Jim Berg asked me what I was wearing during the times when I was assaulted. When he asked me as a junior in college, it never occurred to me what he meant until after I got out of the room. And I was wearing, my neckline was up. There's a 3-finger width rule above your collarbone, below your collarbone. I was wearing things that were loose fitting, that were not immodest, that followed the rules. But the implication, of course, was, and I was even asked, do you understand how guys' minds work? Because it was heavily implied that I must have had something to do with that. And in the end, I was not believed. My parents were told that they should take with a grain of salt what I was saying. Just because I was their child didn't mean that I was telling the truth. As a student, I stopped getting approved to be in theater productions. I stopped getting approved to be a society officer. I got booted out of Who's Who. All these things wouldn't necessarily mean anything alone, but when they were all together my senior year, whereas the guy who assaulted me, he was a preacher boy and he was in the preaching competition. Yes, that's a thing. He was featured as a soloist a couple times. So clearly they believed him over me. And so, yeah. And that is pretty typical, I think, for girls who've had similar experiences to mine.
I'm so sorry. And I'm not surprised by it because that's just what it's like in these environments. With the documentary with Shiny Happy People, I'm so glad that like America can see these awful teachings that are throughout all of fundamentalism and just see how awful it is and how they're trying to spread a lot of these other harmful teachings. And it's interesting to me because I thought, I'm trying to remember this Bible verse, but it came to my mind. It was like, and you shall know them by their fruit.
Mm-hmm.
You'll know them. And like Bob Jones, fundamentalism, it produces rotten, awful fruit. It's terrible.
It does. But there's a huge irony in that too, though, Andrew, in that they're so upset about those of us who are speaking out against the school, but they created us. They're not called fighting fundies for no reason. They taught you that if you know an untruth, you don't stop until you expose the truth and you don't give up. And they created little warriors, armies. That's the reason the truth's coming out now. Is it's just, you can't have it. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You created these little warriors for the truth. And then those of us that got out and said, wait, whoa, that wasn't right. No, this is how the world works. This is what true Christianity is. Of course, we're not going to be quiet. I do find it ironic, but not at all surprising that the Duggars are now saying the American media is, etc., because of course they're going to remain in a martyr state. But you're right. The practices in all these movements are just so damaging and so harmful, and they don't represent a loving God who delights in his creation, and they don't represent God at all. And the worst part about it is that a lot of people just give up altogether on religion, God, morals, because they cannot separate Bob Jones from what God really is. And I had a very difficult time in my adult life keeping the truths of Scripture, but separating the bad application that was applied my whole life.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. And it's just the fascinating thing is like Bob Jones, they think that they have the right interpretation of Scripture and that their interpretation, their application is the truth. And I just think about when they wouldn't allow African American students, when they banned interracial dating, they used the Bible. They're like, oh, this is the truth, this is what God wants. And then they eventually had to say, oh, yeah, we misinterpreted that. Sorry.
But they didn't, I don't believe he ever used the word misinterpreted. I don't remember what he said now. I was a student when Dr. Bob III went on Larry King Live. They made us all gather in the big SMA chapel. It's where they have chapels. There were almost 5,000 students, or at least 5,000 students at that time. And they made us all gather. We didn't know why. And they have Larry King. We weren't allowed to watch cable television. So it was odd that they were live streaming in Larry King. And then we see Dr. Bob III on there, and then he announces, but he didn't say they were incorrect. I can't remember what he said, but he basically said, okay, in the year 2000 or whatever it was, 1999, 2000, okay, you're right. We'll lift the interracial ban, which, I mean, and again, people want to celebrate it and say, yay, they're with the times. It was the year 2000. It was not with the times. Let's not say good job for finally getting up with the times. But yeah, they never fully come out and say that they're incorrect on something. And honestly, I feel as though they would save themselves a lot of heartache if they would just occasionally say, we're sorry, we were wrong. And we're sorry to all the graduates before you. We've changed it. They won't do that though. They just change something and then say those people are disgruntled and they're airing dirty laundry, etc. But yeah.
And it's because they're such a narcissistic institution.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So
That's
narcissistic
right. Yep.
because they care about their reputation above everything else. And like the ironic thing is that their reputation, I think, could have really been saved if they would have done the right thing all the round. And didn't Bob Jones say do right until the stars fall? Like
That's right. That's right. Till the stars fall, unless we tell you not to. Right. Yeah. No. The narcissism, and then if you're going to be the mothership, and that's what they are. They're a mothership for thousands and thousands of other churches. They make the rules. When they say women can wear pants, etc., then all these other churches suddenly women can wear pants. They're the mothership, and to be the mothership and to make the rules and to be able to keep doing that, they can't have ever been wrong on an interpretation of scripture. So they can't admit they're wrong because they want that narcissistic control. But they are the ones saying, this is the interpretation. There is no other room for a different interpretation. And if you don't like it, get out. But if you get out, you're probably going to hell because you had the truth and you chose to not take it. So bye.
Yes. And so the thing with all these different fundamentalist colleges, these fundamentalist organizations, I'm just going to compare Bob Jones University to the IBLP, the Institute of Basic Life Principles, because when I saw the Shiny Happy People documentary, I just was thinking Bob Jones University, because with the IBLP, they had all these different ministries that they would put out, and he had the seminars where all these different churches would come to it, and they would go back to their churches and take these teachings, these fundamentalist teachings from Gothard. But with Bob Jones, I was like, oh my gosh, like this college exists to train fundamentalist soldiers for Christ, to put them in these churches all across the US, to put them missionaries across the world, and just to continue that indoctrination so that then people can go to these churches, recruit people, get them in the teachings, get them to vote, get some of these people in office, all the politics, all the money, and different things. And it was like, oh my God. And there's so many other fundamentalist organizations that are doing the same thing. Going to Bob Jones is just, it's an indoctrination machine. They're making you into this specific kind of person, and they don't want you to leave having your own identity. They want you to leave having the identity that they want you to have and the specific beliefs that they want you to have, because they see it as a truth and see it as something that has to get into the government, that has to really dominate the world and our government. And there's such an urgency around it and such a disregard for people who believe differently, that us versus them mindset of, oh, well, they're not right with God, or, oh, they're not, like, we're better Christians. Like, they say they're a Christian, but we're better ones. We're the best. And I saw this a lot in the IFB, which I grew up in. And so just a lot of similarities between that. And I know we talked earlier, you had mentioned there were, like, you said Timothy students or something that was, so could you explain and talk about what that is?
Yes, Timothy students were students from other countries, but particularly third world countries that would come to Bob Jones, and they would be given housing, food, and free tuition. But they had to major in Bible or music or a ministry of some sort major. I believe that was true. All the ones I know did. And the agreement was you get all these things for free, but you have to go back to your home church and serve or start a church in your home country, and you can't come back for 7 years to the United States. And it was really sad because some of these kids, they came over to America. They didn't want to go back to Eastern Europe or some third world South American country, and some of them would fall in love, but they weren't allowed to marry someone from the United States for 7 years and all this stuff. But those were the Timothy students. And again, part of the larger, broader picture of indoctrinating the world, not for Christ, but for our specific interpretation of the scriptures.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining that. And something I really want to dig into also is really the control that BJU tried to have over you after leaving. So I know we had talked
there was like this booklet of churches. And so if you could talk about those stories.
Yes. When you graduated from Bob Jones, there was an office. I can't remember the name of it, but it was right next to their travel office. So on campus, they were completely their own little world. They had their own post office, their own dry cleaners, their own dining halls, their own theater housing. They had a hospital on campus, and there was an office, and the Office of Extended something, I think it was called, but there was a book in there, and it used to be a notebook. I'm sure it's just a link now, but it was all the approved churches, Bob Jones churches in the United States. And an approved church taught the same things, had the same standards. So like women would wear dresses. There was no Christian contemporary music. You did not go to movie theaters, etc. So they had a book of all the approved places. And I knew people who actually would not take a job out of college in a city where there wasn't an approved Bob Jones church, because Bob Jones wanted you to go out and be part of the local church. For instance, when I got married and moved to Columbus, Ohio, I moved in 2003. There were 4 approved churches in Columbus, Ohio, outlining area, which it's so insane now looking back. But yeah, there were 4 approved churches. So we went to the one my husband grew up at because we didn't know any better. And honestly, it's in our defense, we did what a lot of people did. We thought we were doing the right thing. We thought this is better than Bob Jones, because it was better than Bob Jones. So when we started going to this church, I could wear pants into the building here and there. That sounds so silly now, but it was better than Bob Jones. So you think it's not Bob Jones. And so you think you can fix something that's broken. And then you realize a few years out that you can't fix this. Problem is so large that you're not going to fix it. And that church that we were in, the first one out of college, we found out, just like Bob Jones and every other place, that it was about control and it was about money and who had money. And there was no difference. Yeah. So you had to check the book to see where it was you could go. There was also a book of approved Christian schools, because it would have been better for you as a grad to teach in the public school than a bad liberal Christian school.
Okay. And then, wow. Yeah. It's just the control and the audacity to make that list and say, this is the right way. And like, how are you seen if you didn't go or pick any of those approved churches?
That's also interesting, because there's nepotism within the system and there are hierarchies. And so it all depends on the person and genders. So my husband grew up in a Bob Jones church, but it wasn't a super rigid church. And he was a guy, and he was in leadership, and he could almost do no wrong because he came up through the system. And if he had chosen to go to a different church, probably it would have been chalked up to he's still a good guy. He's not at a great church, but he's still a good guy. If I had picked a church not on the list, having been a faculty kid, knowing the truth my whole life, and choosing to go to a liberal church, and probably the church I grew up in would have told people I really wasn't saved. My whole Christianity and belief would have come into question. Now, other girls that I grew up with that weren't faculty kids, it just all depends on the person, but it's certainly not a favorable view if you decide to go to a church that's not on an approved list.
Yes. And something I want to dig into is, before the Grace Report, how were you treated as a Bob Jones University student and your specific experiences in that environment?
It's really interesting. If you don't mind, I might just start from when I was a kid and growing up. So I was at Bob Jones as a kid from 1979 until 2001. I'm old, but my parents were faculty, and I was talking about hierarchies and classes of people. I've had this discussion a lot since leaving Bob Jones. Staff kids were treated differently than faculty kids, were treated differently than administrative kids. And then, of course, like presidents, like the Jones kids, that was very different. But they're just like a lot of subcultures. There were hierarchies within that. And I was unaware of those as a faculty kid, but I know friends that I have who were staff kids were very aware of it because they were at the bottom of the food chain there. But I'd like to say Bob Jones was all in the family because your entire family had to be all in at Bob Jones or none of you were. So if the man of the household worked at Bob Jones, that could be as a janitor or a PhD, which was also what Dr. Bob Sr. to say in one of his little sayings was that the janitor makes the same amount of money as the PhD because we're all this ironically socialistic type working commune. So everyone in the family had to be there. So you taught there as a man. Your wife had to work on campus. She couldn't be a homeschool mom. She couldn't be a stay-at-home wife. She had to work at the press or in the dining common or teach or do something. And then the kids had to attend nursery through college. And when I say have to attend, I had to always explain that to my students when I taught at the liberal Christian school that I love, that I taught at. They were always like, Mrs. Burchwell, what do you mean had to? My parents would have lost their job if I had even just applied to a different college or just to look. That was not, you didn't do that. And when you grow up together and it's all you know, you just look at that end goal and say, I'm going to put my head down. I'm going to get a free degree. I'm going to graduate with everyone's job intact. I'll make the best out of it and then I'll get out. None of us could have gone elsewhere. It would have meant disaster for our families and what just wasn't worth it. In fact, the head of security on campus, because again, they were their own little world. They had a police unit, I'll say, in parentheses, because it was the Bojo 5-0, we call them. Anyway, they had their own little police force. When I was a child in the 80s, the head of security lived on campus with his family. A lot of families did live on campus. On back campus, there were houses, and those people paid a small token payment to the university and could live on back campus. His teenage kids rented a movie that was rated either PG-13 or R. And I want to say it was something like along the lines of E.T., but maybe it was Dirty Dancing, or it was something to most of the world is completely innocuous, but you weren't allowed to do that. And so they had a little party on campus, watch that. That weekend, they had to be off campus. The guy lost his job, the father lost his job, the mom lost her job, the kids lost their tuition, and they were off campus. And I do think that in the 80s was a look at this, like the public hanging, see what happens. If your kids break the rules, everybody goes. There was immense pressure as a child growing up to not just not embarrass your family, but to not get your parents fired. Everybody had to go. You weren't allowed to homeschool. You had to go to nursery. So there was even on the 3rd floor of Barge Hospital, there was a sick nursery because you weren't allowed to have sick days. So if your child was sick, you still had to teach or work or do whatever it was. You went to the sick nursery, and it was a room full of kids that were just fevers, puking, strep. Everybody sick was in the sick nursery. So all of us faculty kids, we were raised like this little group of little, what's the term? Like minions or something. We're all raised together with the same everything. So as part of this all-inclusive Christian utopia package where the whole family works, they were paid very low pay. And when low, I mean, my dad had 2 master's degrees and a doctorate from an actual school. And in the year 2001, he was making full-time less than $20,000 a year. Well below poverty level, they paid these people. And women were paid a lot less than men. And I know that from seeing my parents' pay stubs. But as part of the low pay, you were given free meals, free tuition, all these other perks. And you were given something called the Promise, also known as the Forsake Me Not Fund. And that was the university promised to take care of you in retirement. Your housing, food, and medical would be covered. In return, you were also not allowed to work any side jobs because the low pay was offset by all these other perks. Fast forward several decades, this fund, which Dr. Bob III would go into many churches, hundreds of churches. There's even a YouTube video online still, and he would ask churches for money for this Forsake Me Not When I Am Old fund to take care of the faculty. So people gave their hard-earned dollars to go, and that was supposed to go to retirement. Well, in the early 2000s, with the rising cost of healthcare, with people living longer. The third floor of Barge Hospital was full of older people, and it was bursting at the seams. And so they had to look at, well, what are we going to do with all these other people about to get old? And they ran out of room, and they looked at buying a retirement home, but it was just too expensive. And so eventually the fund dried up, according to Bob Jones. So they just took the promise away from all these faculty who worked for no other jobs and had no pay for all these years. Their retirement, like in my parents' case, their Social Security was based on this very low pay. My parents did not have enough to live on based on their Social Security, based on Bob Jones. The biggest issue I have with Bob Jones, I have two big issues. The Grace Report obviously is one of them, and the handling of that. But this Promise Fund really hangs me up still, because it's not too late to do something like that. My parents are older. They're both in need of assisted living now, and they haven't done one thing to revive this Promise Fund. They've built multi-million-dollar parking garages on campus. They've renovated their gymnasium. They've done all this stuff, and they won't even just ask churches for some money for this Promise Fund. That is a huge hang up for me with the school. But so that's like a little bit of just growing up. It was everything you did was on display. 3 meals a day, you walked into the dining common, which was where everyone sat and ate. They had the line for the food in the middle. You'd walk through the middle of people. Everybody would sit and comment on people's appearances. There was so much pressure to look perfect, to be perfect, to represent your parents in a perfect light. There was so much pressure all growing up that a lot of us paid the price in our adult mental health from all the pressure of growing up on campus.
Yeah, thank you so much for really digging into that. And wow, like I really I didn't know about that, the forsake me not thing, and I didn't know that they didn't keep that promise at all. And they focus on building their empire instead of taking care of their loyal followers.
I would like to also point out that in the debacles at Bob Jones, which I mostly am blissfully unaware of, but with Steve Pettit stepping down the second or third time, I lost count, people, these positive grads of the university have raised all this money. And again, $50,000 as a going away bonus to Pettit, who is already making $200,000 a year. All that stuff really still does bother me, because they claim to not have money. They have all this very expensive religious art. They paid their faculty nothing. Their faculty in my parents' age bracket still have nothing. But yet here they are. Here's a little $50,000 thank you on your way out. Yeah.
Yeah, so they really exploited people's lives and their labor of their dedication to this university, thinking they would get this in return, and did not. And this is something interesting that really cults do, is they do exploit labor, and it's for the good of the group, it's for God, it's for the ministry, and we'll do all of these things for you. And it sounds like at first Bob Jones was going to do that, but again, when they ran dry, they chose to build their empire, then doing the right thing and taking care of these people who had dedicated their entire lives to this. And I think another thing is, I know it was more prominent then than it is now, but as I've been talking with people, you had everything you needed on campus. There was really rarely a reason to leave. Could you talk about all the different, I know someone told me BJU had a farm. Could you dig into all the different buildings and things on campus and services they provided to really just keep you trapped in this isolated environment?
Yes. Isolation is it's key. I'll talk about the farm, but just to your point about keeping you there, another reason to stay and stick it out, even if your children were not treated well, or even if it was because you didn't have any IRA or whatever it's called, a Roth, you didn't have any retirement. If you chose to leave, then you were starting over in your 50s or 60s. People, they had to stick it out, which to me seems very well thought out on the university's part. It was just one more thing keeping you there. And again, like you said, these people, they exploited people, they exploited workers, and yet they've hung on to supposedly millions and millions of dollars worth of this religious Catholic art. That's a whole nother podcast in and of itself. The art, how did they get it? Did they pay taxes? How did they come into the country? And they're holding on to it. And yet, again, a check for a fraction of one of those pieces in War Memorial Chapel could pay for another year for my parents in assisted living. And they won't do the right thing. They won't do the right thing when it comes to money. They just won't. So yes, they were a self-sufficient campus. They used to have their own farm. The farm was located, 20 miles off site of campus. It shut down. I don't know if this is why it shut down, but I know that shortly after a staff member was electrocuted at the farm and died. And I don't know the full story, but I know that he was up trying to fix up on a pole and was electrocuted. And a couple years after that, there was no more farm. I don't know if it was insurance or that was just, I have no idea why we didn't have the farm anymore, but they used to have all their own milk because they had dairy cows. They used to slaughter their own cows. So they had meat. Students learned agriculture out there. So yeah, the dining come and fed people. The farm had a lot to do with that. The farm also tied into the schooling. There was a post office on campus, a dry cleaners, two theaters, a beautiful chapel, housing on back campus, tennis courts, even a small lake. Of course, the rumor for years was that at Omega Lake, as it was called, which is basically a pond, it's a retaining pond on back campus, that in the 60s, Dr. Bob Jr. was worried about riots and things. And there supposedly was an arsenal of guns underground on campus somewhere near the lake. That was the rumor going around. So yeah, there was rarely a reason to go off campus. Some people chose to live off campus. My parents always chose to live off campus. Some people really couldn't afford to live off campus. I knew a couple friends in the same neighborhood as we were, who were also faculty kids. And because all 3 meals were provided at the school through this cafeteria system, I would go to their house sometimes, playing in their backyard. And I would open the refrigerator as a child. And the only thing in the fridge would be a pitcher of water from the sink. That was it. That's all that was in it. Because you didn't eat between meals. You ate at the dining come in. That wasn't everyone. That wasn't our family. But I do know several families who are like that. So yeah, most of my friends were born on campus in the hospital there and never really went off campus for any reason. The hospital is another interesting thing. When my mom had cancer for the first time in 1987, you had to use doctors there. You had your own doctors at Bob Jones. There were 3 doctors for most of the 80s and 90s that everyone, all 5,000 students, all hundreds of faculty staff kids used. They were very busy. Those are the doctors you used. When my mom needed surgery, a lumpectomy for breast cancer, her surgeon refused to do surgery at Barge on campus because he said it is not equipped for surgery and it's dangerous and I won't do it. They tried to make her switch oncologists because they said, no, we will only cover for you to have surgery here. So people did have surgery at Barge on campus, but it was not really that safe. They did bring in their own anesthesiologist and he wasn't there that long. And I don't know why, but I do know that one of the last things that happened at Barge also, I can't say this is why they closed, but I know that a guy who I went to from kindergarten through college with, his first year out of college, his mom was a nurse at Barge, had been a nurse at Bob Jones for years. He had some sort of routine jaw surgery at Barge. Again, remember in the 80s, my mom's oncologist said, I will not perform surgery there. He died during surgery at Barge. And again, it wasn't around. I guess it was maybe around for 5, 6, 7 more years after that. But yes. So yeah, when you say self-sufficient, I mean, down to food, down to doctors, down to bill, everything was right there. And so a lot of people really didn't get off campus much.
And something I think I want to dig a little bit more into with you as a child in this environment, coping with it. Today you sent me a video and you showed me really like hundreds, maybe even, I don't know, thousands of paper dolls that you made and drew. So could you dig into that with your childhood trauma and what it portrayed and why you made them?
It's funny. My husband, I'm an artist. My husband's an accountant. So It's an interesting combination. We've been married 20 years this August, so it clearly works. But he jokes that had he known about these paper dolls before we got married, that it would have been a deal breaker because he's very creeped out by the whole fact. But yeah, when we were little, there were only so many things on TV you could watch. You really couldn't listen to the radio. Oh, Bob Jones had their own radio station too. Did I mention that? So that you could safely listen to the radio. We weren't allowed to listen to anything that had any kind of drum beat except for Sousa marches, and that's whatever. Because it went back to African drums and sexual beats. I believe that Duggar documentary also touched on that. But anyway, yeah, entertainment-wise, we played outside, we played house, or we were allowed Barbies. I know a lot of people were not allowed Barbies. So my therapist now has told me that what I did instead of journaling was I actually drew the world around me. I just thought I was playing when I was little, but I drew more than 1,000, probably a couple thousand paper dolls. And they were just people that I cut out on some of them on notebook paper. But I started when I was in first grade, and my sister and I would play with them for a long time. And I hadn't looked at them in a couple decades. I found them in my parents' attic just a couple years ago. And I thought, oh, this will be fun to put them in a book. And when I started categorizing them by like women, men, just for my own sake, to put them in a memory book, I was really taken aback by how scary they really were. So if you look at them, all the men have short hair and sideburns that don't go below the middle of the earlobe. That was the rule. And no facial hair, and collared shirts and khaki pants. And it's like page after page of different men in collared shirts, khaki pants. And then women had long skirts and long hair, or it just, the outward appearance was just, so it just very looks like a cult. And those were the people around me. And I know now, looking back, that I was drawing actual people that I know. I can say, oh, that was that person. She taught third grade, or this person was in the registrar's office, and this person, whatever. But as a child, I was just constantly observing the world around me. It's funny because a lot of the paper dolls, this is a really weird rabbit trail, but interesting. A lot of the paper dolls have like medical issues, like they're missing a foot or they have a black eye. And I've talked in depth to my therapist about this as well. A lot of the entertainment we had growing up was prayer request time at church, because again, we weren't going to movies, or you were seeing a Bob Jones play or a Shakespeare play that was cleaned up, I might add. And so people would give these very dramatic prayer requests about injuries and newborn babies being born prematurely. And oddly enough, the paper dolls I drew reflected these really severe prayer requests that would come through our church. But it's just that was my worldview, and it was all we knew. And it's crazy to look back at, but they're two pop culture references that I give people who don't understand what I'm talking about. Of course, now this Duggar documentary can be my third. So thank you, Duggars. But I'm stealing this from my pastor. The movie M. Night Shyamalan's The Village, that movie is very much like how we were in this insulated world. Dr. Bob started it because supposedly he didn't want the free thinking, drug touting, sex, rock and roll universities. He wanted a safe place. So we were lied to about the outside world and the other churches because it was the scary woods. So The Village is a really great analogy. And then Kimmy Schmidt, of course, where she comes out of the ground and she goes to New York City, and she's lived in a nuclear fallout her whole life, and she comes out and she's what? And that's how I feel with like 80s pop culture. I don't know 80s music very well, or because we weren't allowed to listen to any of that stuff.
I love that you mentioned The Village, because when I watched The Village, I thought the same exact thing. In like growing up in fundamentalism, how there's all these scary things in these woods, and you don't cross this, like, you don't go into this territory, you stay within these confines. And oh my gosh, oh yes, and the last like official question, I think, is how has your healing journey been since leaving this environment?
So my healing journey has been one of many different factors. So my childhood, on growing up on a campus, like, that was so isolating. The pressure of being a perfect Christian from the time I could talk, the grace report, what happened to me there, and my also equally abusive church. So my healing has been through a lot of different aspects. And something that happened to me last year where I dropped some glass. I'm a real klutz. I work with vases and flowers a lot, and I'm an artist, so scissors, and I'm always getting stitches. And I dropped something on my foot. I had to get about 7 stitches in my foot. And long story short, a suture or something got embedded down in there. And so the wound healed and was a lot better than it used to be. But if you touch on my foot in a certain spot, you can feel this something still there. And it's a lot better than it used to be. But there's something down under there still. And I thought about what a great analogy it is for those of us who've come through a journey, like for me, even the Grace Report. So I allowed myself to heal up from my time at Bob Jones, and I didn't address what was underneath the surface, but I managed to go on with my life. And I thought, it's way better than it was. It's way better than it was. But then you get a new pair of sandals and it hits you at the wrong spot, or there are these triggers in life. Part of my healing journey really came when the Grace Report came along, because they allowed me to say, we can go under anesthesia and cut that out and stitch it back up, and you'll feel a lot better. Initially, you won't, but we can help you get better. We can get that thing under the surface out. So when I was allowed to sit in front of people during the Grace Report, and they looked me in the eye and they listened to every word I said, and they said, we believe you. And they had tears in their eyes and they cried when I cried. That was so healing for me. Working up to it and getting it out was awful. Digging around for that, whatever in your wound, it was painful. And the recovery after that was painful. But now it's hard to imagine that I would have not done that. And so the Grace Report was a really big moment for me to say, you know what, I'm getting it all. Let's get it out. Let's just get it out and let's feel better later. So when I was able to start that process, I felt a lot better. Ironically, when my parents got fired from Bob Jones, I felt a lot freer to speak out, and I didn't have that fear of getting them fired anymore. The worst had happened. They had been fired. So I was able to speak. And the more I told my story to people, and the more I saw that other people had stories like mine, and the more I saw online that I'm not the only one, I'm not crazy, there are a lot of people in the same boat as I was all very confirming and very healing for me. And I've been able to share my story a lot now. I feel like I've been able to help people as well. I'm really thankful for that liberal Christian school I went to. They let me give my testimony very early on when it was rough, and I'm sure they let me hack my way through it. I'm sure it didn't have a really great moral tone to it, but they let me speak my truth, and it was so healing for me. That was a huge part of my journey, was sharing and healing and meeting other people. I've been through a lot of therapy. I have a Christian therapist. I have other therapists that are not Christian. I've had medication, I've had holistic, I've done everything that I can to get better and to feel better. When you can physically feel better, you can emotionally begin to heal. Taking care of myself, self-care has been a lifelong struggle. And part of that comes from how I was raised, in that life is short and people are dying and going to hell every day. We had to quote that in chapel, that everywhere around you, someone is dying. So I don't know why you're taking a break, because people are going to burn alive if you don't get up and do something. So self-care has been a struggle for me, but it's so important. I had to get away from a lot of toxic people in my life. And for me, that was anybody that was supporting the school in any way. So any staff member that was still there, or any person sending as good of a friend as they were of mine, if they're sending their kids there, I couldn't do it. It was toxic to me, and I had to get all that out. I did get off social media for a little bit, and that helped. And then I had to make peace with myself, not the university, so to speak, but with myself, and knowing things like, I forgive myself for what I did when I was a student there. I was still in the culture of turning people in, and I was doing that from a place of that. I thought that was the right thing to do. And I know now that it wasn't. And I can never go back and apologize to everybody that I hurt. But I know that at the same time, I forgive those, all of us who've come out now. There's just a general knowledge of that we forgive each other. I'm sorry for what I said when I was hungry, or whatever. The phrase, like, I'm sorry for what I did when I was there. But we all did it. We all thought we were doing the right thing. And we were all doing the wrong thing. So forgiving myself for those things too. And then changing and not being afraid to change and become a better person. I'm constantly saying, all right, where have I been wrong? Because I've been wrong a lot. I'm not every interview or every post I've done has been in the right spirit or the right tone, or some of it's been self-serving in the past, but I'm getting better and I'm getting better. But I will say this, people will still say to me, why can't you just move on? Or why do you have to keep bringing this up? And the simple answer to that is because it hasn't changed. They haven't changed. They may have raised the skirt length or the short length. They may listen to bluegrass now. They may do these things, but the culture of fear and sweeping things under the rug, and even just apologizing for past wrongs or making things right, like the promise, none of this has actually gone away or changed. And just as late as 2019, it's public record. You can look it up online. A girl was raped by Furman soccer players. She and her friend were drugged and given alcohol and then raped. Long story short, she was afraid to do a rape kit that night because she was afraid she'd get kicked out. She did get kicked out. Randy Page, who grew up with my husband and who knows me, but has not been very kind to us in the past 10 years, he told the Greenville News she didn't get kicked out of Bob Jones because she was raped. She got kicked out because she drank alcohol. The whole point, Randy and everyone else, is not that she drank alcohol. The point is this child was terrified to get a rape kit because she was afraid of being kicked out. And she was kicked out. The point is that culture of fear is still there. That pressure on women is still there. And you can change any of these little outward things that you'd like. There, you've got a problem. This was 2019. The lawsuit is still ongoing. And again, no one has apologized for that until, I would say to Bob Jones the same thing they've said to us our whole life. Until there's repentance, until there's a change, then what am I supposed to believe? You haven't changed. And that's where I stand when people try to say, why can't you just move on? I have moved on. I have a very good life. I cannot complain about anything in my life. I love my life. But I also know that things happen to us for a reason. And if we don't use our life experiences to help the next person, and especially the person we've been in their shoes, and that's girls who are still down there, who may not want to be down there. Girls who are afraid to go forward because they're going to get kicked out, even though they've been raped. If we don't speak up, then what was the point of me going through all of that?
Wow. Thank you so much for all those powerful, inspirational words. And I'm so sorry for all that you've been through. And I applaud you for speaking up about it. And you're exactly right. I've had people tell me, why don't you just move on? And it's like the analogy of you see a burning building and you get yourself out, but you don't tell anyone else. You save yourself and you save no one else. And I told someone, I'm like, I wouldn't feel right being quiet and letting this abuse, letting these toxic teachings still continue to influence and harm people. And I'm so grateful that you've been a part of this podcast to help bring light, because I think there are a lot of people in Greenville who are like, that Bob Jones is a terrible place, but they don't know enough, I think, about it, or I've dug into it. So I'm really excited for this podcast to pull back the curtain and show people what's really going on behind the gates, behind the scenes. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast, being vulnerable, digging these really hard things and hard subjects. And thank you so much for sharing your healing journey and as an encouragement to others.
Thank you for having me again. I really appreciate you and all the effort you're putting into getting the word out. Organizing something like this is a big feat. It's a huge task, but it's so vitally important because there's still a whole campus of kids down there. And say what you want, but we know that they're kids there right now who don't know that they have a choice because they feel like they don't have a choice. Their churches will disown them. Their parents won't pay for a penny for them to go somewhere else. They don't think they have a choice. And like you said, with the burning building, it's still burning. It may not be burning on every floor, but it's still burning. And there's still people in the places where it's burning. And again, until I see these huge gross atrocities apologized for and corrected, I will not believe that that place is better.
Yeah, and yeah, for people listening, thank you so much for listening. And because I know this podcast, it's not an easy listen at all. And if you could please just share this podcast and leave a review to combat the haters who will just give me bad reviews. So please support this podcast through that way. And thank you again, Erin, for coming on the show.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. If you are listening on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, if you could leave a 5-star rating, this will help other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you.